Walking with Jesus through the Gospels, and we are in Perea still. But we're in the book of John, chapter 11. So we've spent time in Luke chapter 17 is where we were last week. We dipped our toes into the waters of John chapter 11 last week. So we basically just rippled the waters regarding that, whetting our appetites for seeing what would be taking place on our journey tonight. So are you ready for an uphill walk? It's going to be quite the hike. That's what the Jericho Road is like. So you got your hiking shoes on? Let's pick up John chapter 11. We're looking at verses 1 through 4 to begin.
Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he who you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it.
Lazarus and his sisters, Martha and Mary, live in a place called Bethany, in Hebrew, Bethany. And Jesus himself had gone to the region on the other side of the Jordan River called Bethany. So there seems to have been a number of cities, villages throughout Israel that had been set up by the Essenes that were a network of poorhouses. In other words, houses for taking care of strangers, those that are sojourners, don't have many supplies, are in need of help and assistance. So these places became settled over time and retained those names, Bethany, Bethania. So word is sent from the Bethania close to Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives, and being sent to the region where Jesus has been. Now, I want us to have a look at the screen so that we can have an idea. We can visualize where Jesus is. Let's bring you over here. All right, so you see on this map, in the circled area is the region of Perea. All right, you notice that? And this is the region to which Jesus had gone. This is where he's been, that we have been witnessing the various interactions that he's been having. Who's the last people he's been speaking to? Do you remember? His disciples. Over here, right?
Yeah, not the Pharisees, but
yeah,
over here.
That's right, yeah. All right, so that's where they've been since chapter 13 of Luke until chapter 17 in the middle or the early part of that chapter in verse 10. So after Jesus has been addressing his disciples, now they receive word from some messengers coming from Bethania on the Mount of Olives. And the word that is being brought to them is Lazarus, the one whom you love, is sick. It's interesting that when they give word, the word isn't Lazarus whom you love is sick, but it is simply the one whom you love is sick. Let's look at the next slide. So on this, you get a bit of an idea, the picture of the distance that would be traveled from where Jesus is at this point in time, heading up the Jericho Road and heading on to Bethany. So you can see that white line as the journey, the road traveled to Bethany. As we continue on, we're going to take a bit of a road view to it now. All right, so this is having had traveled the Jericho road, and we're on the last part of the ascent. So it's going from the lowest point on earth. So the Dead Sea is the lowest point on earth, land-wise, and heading upwards to Jerusalem, some 770 meters above sea level. So you're not just going 770 meters up. You are already at 1,300 meters below sea level. So you are going up 2,000 meters from the area that you are, where Jesus has been in the region of Perea, or about that, because the Dead Sea is a bit lower than the region of Perea, which is just a bit north of that. So, of course, this is a modern-day aerial view of traveling the Jericho Road, and what you see on the top of the mount of that on the horizon, that's the Mount of Olives. All right? And so the arrow indicates the direction that the original road or route would have taken. And as we come to the next slide, you can see that there are two villages there. One is Bethany, or Bethania, and do you remember how to pronounce the other one? Bethphage. Yeah, Bethphage. So this is where Jesus will be heading towards, but he's not heading there immediately. Let's just give you a little bit better context. So if you continued on that route in that direction, you will see now is Bethphage in the picture, and just off screen to the left of that would be Bethany. And then you see the Mount of Olives is indicated right there, and then if you just click once, you will see that that encircled area is the Dome of the Rock, the Temple Mount. So, of course, the Dome of the Rock would not have been there in Jesus' day. That would have been the temple, Herod's temple. So this is the region to which they will be heading eventually. And that's, of course, where these messengers had come from. So we have that a description that this is the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment, wiped his feet with her hair. It's interesting that John gives this description about her, although we don't get the detail about this until the next chapter. So John has not told us about this episode yet, but it must have been that it was widely enough spread that it was common knowledge amongst numerous people in the church. And so John referencing Mary as such, that it would be, oh, okay. And then so when then John gives the details of it in the next chapter, they're already clued in and connected with what's been taking place. When we see what's taking place in verse 3, the sisters sent to him, the one whom you love is sick. Jesus gets this message, and when he receives it, he says that the illness is not going to end in death. It's for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. We're going to expand that a little bit in just a moment. But I want us to, I gave a little bit of homework to the group here after camera was done. I said, if you want, you can go and see what a connection there was when it says this is for the glory of God. What other event, what other thing John writes about that says that Jesus said that this is for the glory of God. Anybody remember what that was? Did anybody remember to do that or check it out? This is for the glory of God. And he's already dealt with it, so it's not something yet to happen. Pardon me? No, it's something that is already taken place. Something that he has already done. He's addressed the disciples and he says, this is for the glory of God. It's quite a long time ago. It was around the Feast of Tabernacles, and we are coming upwards. We're coming upon Passover, and we will see that near the end of chapter 11, we'll see that the Passover was approaching, and so it's coming on about at least 4 months ago, possibly closer to 5, that this had taken place, and it's back in John chapter 9. So let's have a look at John chapter 9. So this is the man who was born blind, and the disciples said, "Who sinned that this man was born blind? Was it the man, of course, when he was still in his mother's womb, or was it his parents?" And Jesus answered, "Neither." And he's correcting the attitude that they had, which was the result of the false teaching of the Pharisees. And so he says it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that what? So that the glory of God may be revealed, or the works of God may be displayed in him, which is the same context in which this is being spoken about. Now, in this instance, these two instances taken together, where it's for the glory of God, or so that the works of God might be displayed in him, and that's referring to the glory of God. In both of these two situations, the blind man and now Lazarus, who Jesus says the sickness will not end in death. Of course, a bit of a spoiler alert, Lazarus did die. All right, I hope I didn't ruin it for you right now. I'd encourage us that when we come to the Scriptures, come to it as though you don't know what's coming, so that we can hear it again for the first time, so that we don't project things upon the text or anticipations that, it's hard to do that, because what you can't unknow what you already know, right? But if we already know that Lazarus dies, and we know that Jesus is going to raise him from the dead, we need to be aware that the people at the point where we are in verse 4 don't know any of that. Okay, the disciples don't know that. The only details they have is what Jesus is giving to them here at verse 4. That's all they know. They know that word has come, Lazarus. They find out that it's Lazarus, the one you love, is sick, and Jesus says it's not going to end in death. It's for the glory of God. And when he says that, their ears are going to perk up and will say, there wasn't a long, long time ago when Jesus said that about another situation. And of course it was back in chapter 9, about 4.5 or 5 months earlier. And when I say that, I mean in the time frame in which Jesus was ministering. So the context, all right? So Lazarus dies and he is brought back to life. So the glory of God being revealed in chapter 9 with the blind man. What is given to the blind man? Sight. Another way of speaking of that, somebody who has no sight, they're in what? They're in darkness. When they have sight, they're in light. All right, so in this instance with the blind man, light is given. In chapter 11, about 4.5 or 5 months later, what's given to Lazarus? Life. And John starts off his gospel. Let's go to John chapter 1. John chapter 1. And I want us to look at verse 4 and 5.
Okay, John 4 and 5. John 1, 4 and 5.
Yes, please.
In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it.
All right, and where it says has not understood it literally means has not overcome it or overpowered it. So in him, in whom? Jesus, the Word. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's speaking about Jesus. We see in verse 14, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. So we see that in him was life, and that light was the light of men. We see these two aspects that Jesus comes to bring, life and light. When we see this brought to us regarding him, we go down and we will see that, let's look at verses 16 through 18.
From the fullness of his grace, we have all received one blessing after another. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known.
All right, so Jesus is making the Father known. If we go back up to verse 14, I mentioned part of it, but I didn't finish it, where I said, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. But it continues and says, and we have seen his glory. Glory is of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. So here Jesus now in John chapter 11 for the second time in reference to an event, a display that's going to take place through the work that he's going to perform. He's going to bring glory to God the Father. So the Father is going to be glorified in and through this situation. All right, so we have no request being made when Jesus is informed that the one you love is sick. They don't ask anything, do they? There's nothing stated. That's all it said. So whether John is just summarizing what took place and leaving us to fill in the blanks, or this is all that transpired. That's all that was communicated. Now, no doubt there was small talk that took place. Welcome to have you and rest for a while before you return back, because they're not going to head back immediately. Why? The messengers, that is. It's too far away. It's a day's journey coming from Bethany on the Mount of Olives to Perea, the Bethany and the region on the other side of the Jordan, which is the eastern side of the Jordan. So they would rest, they would sleep the night, and then they would make tracks early the next morning. So they'd be heading back then. So they would have been interacting, and they would have perhaps prayed together and read some scriptures together or recited scriptures together. They wouldn't have had copies of the scriptures, but recited them and so on. Nothing is asked of Jesus that's recorded for us. Does that seem interesting to you? John's indicating to us here that they're leaving it in Jesus' hands. He'll know what to do. But there's got to be something of a disappointment for Martha and Mary when the messengers return and Jesus is not with them. All right, so we don't know that yet because we haven't read that far. Let's pick it up now in verse 5, and let's take it down to verse 8 to begin.
Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." But Rabbi, they said, "A short while ago Jews tried to stone you, and yet you are going back there."
Interesting, isn't it, that they are concerned about what's going on back in Judea, especially coming so close to Jerusalem, because in Bethany or Bethania, they're only a couple of miles away from Jerusalem. It's just over the crest of the Mount of Olives. So we have that Jesus loved whom? All right, so it doesn't just say he loved these three. It doesn't say that he loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus, as we would tend to group everything together. But it says, so Jesus loved Martha and, doesn't name Mary specifically, but and her sister and Lazarus. It's indicating a love for each one of them individually, not just as a grouping together. But it's interesting what we see in verse 6. He loved them so much that he what? That he stays where he was how many more days? 2 more days. All right, if you're sick and you were asking Jesus for help, for healing, for a response, there's no telephone. He didn't tell the messengers, I'm staying here a few more days. They leave, and he just stays 2 more days where he was. Is that going to be disconcerting to you? It make you start to wonder, all right, the messengers are back. They give you a report that we gave him the message. So they're saying, well, he should be along any time. Okay, he didn't arrive today. Well, surely he'll be here by the morning or late in the day tomorrow. He'll make his way as quickly as he possibly can get here. But he doesn't do that, does he? Why? Because he loved them. Because he loved them, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Something like saying, I love them too much to leave right away. I love them too much to show up just yet. But he doesn't delay his travel, because delay speaks of something of putting it off just for an arbitrary reason. God is never late. And he's never early, is he? He's always on time. Because we consider early or late to be dependent upon our reckoning of when something ought to take place. But God always does things according to his timetable, and his timetable, his schedule, is always exact. It's always precise, and it's always for his glory and for our best. Always, always, always. So he stays where he is for 2 more days. What was he waiting for? Waiting for him to die? No. Because by the time the messengers arrived and tell Jesus, Lazarus is already dead. So Jesus isn't waiting for him to die. Lazarus is already dead. He died probably early in the morning of the day that the messengers left. So when they left, it wasn't long after they left and Lazarus died. So they get there on day 1, give Jesus the message. They leave the next morning. Jesus stays where he was for 2 more days. On the next day, what does he do? On the 3rd day, he heads to, pardon me? All right, so the first day, the messengers traveled to him. Then day 2 and 3, he stayed 2 more days. Then on that 3rd day after receiving it, then he leaves that next morning. Early in the morning, he would have left to arrive on the 4th day. So he's not waiting for Lazarus to die. He's waiting to come and show the glory of God in a way that the glory of God could not be displayed otherwise. Why did he arrive on the fourth day instead of on the third or the second day? Why did he determine that that was a good idea?
Didn't the Jews have a certain superstition or something that the person that the spirit is still hung around the body for like 3 days and then after that it's gone or something?
All right, yeah. So in the Babylonian Talmud and the Tahuma Mishkets, they have a teaching in it, or a recording, comes from the oral law, saying this: although the soul protests its birth into the world, it also protests the body's death. It lingers near the body for 3 days, hoping that it will return to life. After 3 days, the soul returns to God to await the time of resurrection. So basically, up until 3 days afterwards, there is a slight chance that the soul could re-enter the body. But after the third day, that's the end, because the soul will leave close proximity to the body and be where God is. Of course, that's tradition that they were holding to. This was not, no biblical teaching, no biblical backing for this, but Jesus was doing this not to reinforce their understanding, but to show them that in spite of their understanding, that what for their minds are an absolute impossibility. Raising somebody from the dead is an impossibility no matter how long that person's been dead, right? Be it a day, several hours, an hour, it doesn't make a difference. If the person's dead, they're dead. And so the only one that could bring that person back to life is God himself. So he does this to demonstrate what in their minds is he's deader than dead. He's really dead now. Right? And when Jesus comes and they say, well, it's already the fourth day, when he says, where have you laid him? And then they take him to the tomb. He says, roll away the stone. And the protest is, but it's the fourth day already. And by now now you got to do the King James. By now he stinketh. I mean, he stinks is one thing. But it gives it more when you do the King James. He stinketh. I mean, that's really bad, right? All right.
Whatever you say.
Whatever I say. Thank you. Thank you for giving me that. All right, so Jesus said then, let us go to Judea again. So I mentioned already, at this point, Jesus is in Perea, the region of, he went first to Bethany, back in chapter 10 and verse 40. He went away again across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing at first, Bethany. So 10 and verse 40. But since that time, he had spread out in the region of Perea and possibly kept close to Bethany. Perhaps he came back to that frequently. But in Luke chapters 13, I think it's verse 22 or thereabouts, on to 17 and verse 10, he's been in the region of Perea and interacting with the Pharisees and the crowds that have been there. So now he's going back to Judea, going back into the territory of the Pharisees, the Jewish leaders. Now, it didn't mean that there weren't Pharisees elsewhere, but that's their jurisdiction, so to speak. So that's why the disciples then said to him, they've been looking to stone you, and now you're heading back into that region? I mean, are you crazy? And of course, they didn't say it in so many words, but they're like, what are you thinking? You're going back into the very area that you're putting yourself at risk because you're the target, but what's their greater concern?
Themselves.
Themselves. Because if he's the target, then they're collateral damage, right? Because they are hanging around with the target. All right, so we've gone on to verse 8. We've just finished that. So let's pick it up then in verse 9. Let's head down to verse 16.
Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they will see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." The disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." And Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us go, that we may die with him."
I really like what takes place in verses 14 and 15. Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. But he doesn't stop there. He says what? "And I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there." Why is he glad for their sakes that he wasn't there? So that they may believe. See, John's gospel is all about belief. I write to you so that you may believe. Well, the scriptures all is about writing so that we would believe. But John specifically uses terms like that, very direct about believing in Jesus, believing who he says that he is, and having a more revelation about him in situations that they couldn't anticipate. And if they could have anticipated or designed it, they would have avoided those situations. Especially for the likes of those who are closest to the situation, Martha and Mary. They would have designed it, and we'll hear it. "If you'd have been here, my brother would not have died." Well, Jesus wasn't, and was it because he was unaware of it and he'd only got news when the messengers came? I don't think so. I think that he's in preparation to receive the messengers, that it's not a shock to him when they show up. I think by the Spirit, his omniscience that he chose to lay aside, in other words, not divest himself of, not that he took it off, but chose not to utilize completely, so that he had dependency upon the Father, so that the understanding, the knowledge, the wisdom that he had came from him. But it was such close and intimate relationship and communion that he had with his Father that it was something where it wasn't held back from Jesus. So does that make sense? He didn't set his divinity, his omniscience aside. He didn't set his glory aside and leave it in heaven when he came to earth. It was veiled. And he chose not to display it or demonstrate it or to access it as he would have if he was fully, if he was in heaven and fully unveiled, if you will, fully in his glory. If we go back up a few verses, when he says, aren't there 12 hours in a day? What's he talking about there? Why is he speaking about 12 hours in a day? And if you walk in the day, he's not going to stumble because he sees the light of this world. anyone walks at night, then he's going to stumble because the light is not in him. What is he talking about when he says that? Any idea with that? He's telling his disciples there's a time. And he's saying that I have work to do, and I'm untouchable until that work is completed. And you need to walk with me, trust me, because I am the light of this world. And he said that several times. So he says, don't get concerned about me because my time is not yet come, is essentially what he's saying to his disciples. So he tells them that our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. I'm going to wake him up. And they said, well, if he's asleep, he's going to get better because you need sleep in order to recuperate. But Jesus, when he says he's asleep, he's talking about the sleep of death, but he's going to raise him from the dead. So he speaks it more directly after their response to this. And he says, guys, Lazarus is dead. He has died. How does he know this? Exactly. It's not something, he didn't get it on the wire. He didn't check Facebook that morning.
Yeah.
It's something that he received from the Father. It was a word of knowledge. It was knowledge that he had received. So his knowledge is complete, just as when he would be in the crowds and then the Pharisees would be thinking something, and Jesus, we're told, and Jesus answering them said, but they didn't ask a question at that point. What is he answering? He's answering their thoughts. He's answering their questions that they are thinking regarding the situation or regarding him. And how does he know that they're thinking these things? It's because God is giving him the information. He's walking in that knowledge that comes from God. So he says, all right, we're going to him now. They're probably wondering, well, why did we wait so long? Things like that. But Thomas, he says, what does he say? Let's go so that we can die with him. It sounds kind of fatalistic, doesn't it?
At least,
All right.
At least he's still committed. He still went. He could have just took off.
Pardon me? You got a point there, yeah. What do we know about Thomas? What is he most well known for? Doubting Thomas. Why is he known as Doubting Thomas?
Negative things to say.
He had a lot of negative things to say. What else did he say that was negative?
I won't believe unless I see the nails on his hands. Yeah.
All right, so that's found later on after Jesus' resurrection in John chapter 20. So he says, I won't believe unless I see the nails, prints in his hands, and I put my fingers in them, and I put my hand in his side. All right, so he said a lot of negative things, was the comment I heard. What other things did he say?
Well, he's willing to die.
Okay, besides this, though. What else has he said that's negative?
Where you're going, but how come you know the way? Is what he said, but it's not negative.
It's not really negative. He's just asking a question. So that's John chapter 14. So Thomas doesn't speak a whole lot.
The only time.
Well, John doesn't record it anyway.
Well, yeah, exactly. So what isn't recorded for it? Not just John, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they don't record it for us either.
Nothing that John.
Right, so only John writes about Thomas, and we have it here, we have it in John 14, and we have it in John chapter 20. So here, it's, let's go so that we can die with him. John 14 is, we don't know the way to where you are going. And in John chapter 20, it's, I'm not going to believe, guys, I'm not going to take your word for it unless I see him with my own eyes. And I put my fingers in the nail holes and my hand in his side, I'm not going to believe. And of course, Jesus shows up in front of him and he says, behold, look, here are my hands and my side. Touch me. And he doesn't even need to do that. What does he do? He falls to his knees and he says, "My Lord and my God." All right, so the comment was he says a lot of negative things. But he doesn't say but one negative thing. I will not believe unless, right? Here you might say, well, is it negative? Well, it's kind of a commitment, isn't it? Let's go. We're not going to desert or run away from him. Let's keep going. I mean, if we die, we die. It's kind of what he's saying. Why does he get the bad rap as being the doubter? Do you ever say doubting Peter? Have you ever heard anyone say, tell me about Peter? What kind of a descriptor word can you use about Peter? What is it? Denying. Kind of impetuous. Compulsive. Impulsive. Impulsive. That too. What about John? Oh, silence.
The disciple that Jesus loved.
Disciple that Jesus loved, son of thunder. So the other brother is James. What do you know about James? What is a characteristic about James? Son of thunder.
He also sought for glory.
Sought for glory. What about Didymus?
That's Thomas.
Okay, good. What about Bartholomew? Characteristic about Bartholomew? Encourager. How do we get that? Okay, not the same guy. So you're thinking of Barnabas. So Bartholomew is not, we don't know about him. So we could go through all of the 12 disciples, and the one that gets the tag as being the doubter is, turn with me to Mark chapter 16. Pardon me? Mark chapter 16. I want to read 9 to 11. Are we at... We're back here, okay.
Flipping pages.
No problem.
Now when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him, and they mourned and wept. But when they heard he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it.
Okay, so who has she gone and told? The disciples. And how many of them believed? How many of them doubted? All right, let's continue on. Let's look at verses 12 and 13.
After Jesus appeared in a different form to 2 of them while they were walking in the country, these returned and reported it to the rest, but they did not believe them either.
What? How many didn't believe? So they were all doubters. Unbelievers.
It's a little bit different than doubting. Doubting, you're kind of like, oh, I'm not so sure. It's saying they did not believe, like, nuh-uh.
Right. Okay, so it's almost worse than doubting.
And even the verse, I think in John 20, it's more of an unbelief than a doubting, right?
For Thomas? Yes. All right, so the situation then is how many of the disciples were doubters? All 11 of them. Saying, what do you mean, why not 12? Because one is Judas and he's dead. He hung himself. All right, so something for us to be aware of, that we need to be careful not to put labels on somebody just because one incident and that seems to be the focus, because everybody focuses on Thomas. But if you took it in context, we would see that Thomas wasn't the only one who didn't believe. They all didn't believe. All of them. Well, in this instance, here he is. He's saying, all right, he's full steam ahead. Let's go and see what takes place. All right, so verse 17, let's go to 27.
Where are we?
Sorry, back in John 11.
Is it 27?
Yes, I think that's what what we were looking at. Yes, yeah.
On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus was already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them that lost their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Jesus, yes, Lord, she told him, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world.
Jesus arrives, and he finds that Lazarus has been in the tomb 4 days. That doesn't mean that he didn't know. He knows that he's already been dead, and he knows for how long, and that's why he had spent as long as he did before he ended up returning. Martha, when she comes out to Jesus, when she finds out that he's there, she already knows that Lazarus died before Jesus had even received news of his illness. But she's wondering, why didn't you come at least to console us in our sorrow and our mourning, our time of loss? What was so important that you stayed where you were the extra time instead of coming to us immediately and directly? It almost seems like he's 4 days late, doesn't it? But he's not. Here's what she says when Martha heard that Jesus is coming. Mary remained in the house. She went to Jesus and said, if you'd have been here, my brother would not have died. But she says, even now, what?
Whatever you want.
So even now, I know that God will do whatever you ask. So what is she saying in that? Is she saying, so if you ask God, I know that he'll come back from the dead? I don't think so. I think what she's saying here is, regardless, I still trust you. I still believe in you. I've not left you, and as far as my faith and trust in you is concerned. It's been confusing, perhaps, difficult, perhaps, but I still trust you. I still believe in you. Jesus speaks to her, says what? What's the first words that he says to the sorrowful?
Your brother will rise again.
Your brother will rise again. And her response? I know. I know he will. In the resurrection, which is when? What?
When Jesus, I don't know.
What does she say? Let's use her words. At the last day. I know that he'll be resurrected on the last day. Who's going to be the one who will resurrect him? Jesus. Turn to John chapter 5 for a minute. Looking at verse 27 to 29. And we're at, is it Todd?
For me.
Okay.
So it's chapter 5.
Yes, 27 to 29.
And he has given him authority to judge because he is the Son of Man. Do not be amazed at this, for a time is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out, and those who have done what is good will rise to live, and those who have done what is evil will rise to be condemned.
So at whose voice are those going to be resurrected? Son of Man. So Jesus' voice, they're going to rise. They will be resurrected, some to eternal life and some to eternal damnation. Now, Martha doesn't necessarily know the full theology of all of that, but she does know, and she does believe in a resurrection. Daniel speaks about it, at the very least, and she knows that he will be resurrected as all those who are dead in faith in God, that they will be resurrected at the last day. But Jesus has more that he's going to speak to her here, more that he wants to show. And he tells her that I am the resurrection and the life. He's saying resurrection is not something I do. He says I am the resurrection and the life. Not something I have, not something I perform, but something that I am. I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will not die. Did Lazarus believe in Jesus? Yes, but here he is dead. What's Jesus saying? Well, in order to get an understanding, we continues on. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. So he's speaking about eternal life here. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die, meaning that they'll not be touched by the second death. And then he asks her a question. Here, he does not ask this. He doesn't say, do you understand this? He asks her the question, do you believe this? Because we don't have to understand fully everything that we are asked to believe. Does that mean that we don't seek to understand? No. It just means that we don't need to understand every intricacy about the Scripture in order for us to believe the Word of God, to take God at His word. I don't have to understand what the electrician tells me when he explains something about how my breaker panel is not suited to code, and it needs to be replaced, or it can't carry the load, or whatever. All I need to do is believe him. I need to trust him. What's that?
Okay.
Okay, yeah. All I need to do is pay the man. Believe the man.
And pay him.
I don't have to understand everything that my mechanic does on my car. But when he says, and he's a trustworthy man, when he says you need this work done, I don't necessarily understand what went wrong, what is it, why, and so on, but I trust the man, so I believe him, and I entrust the work to him. I may learn some of it along the way, but I don't need to understand it to believe it. I don't need to understand to trust. So she says, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. In other words, the one who we've been anticipating, I know that you are him. So at this, she went and called her sister. So Mary is still back in the house. So she brings her into a secluded room, into private, and tells her this: the teacher is here, and he's calling for you. See, Jesus doesn't go to the house, but he calls for Mary to come out. Why? Because the house is full of people. So Jesus is looking for something less public. He wants to speak into her. So as a result, she takes off and ran to him quickly. So he hadn't come into the village, verse 30. He was still where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who had been with Mary and Martha in the house saw that Mary left, they figured that she was going to the tomb, so they went with her so that they could be a support and that sort of thing to her. Some would be weeping with her along the way, and others would have been paid mourners to come along. That was the culture, society of that day. Yes, people would actually come, and they would be paid to mourn at the death of a loved one, to grieve with you. It's foreign to us, isn't it? Completely foreign to us. But such was the case. She says the same thing as Martha said. Lord, if you'd have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. So this was verse 32. So Jesus, when he sees her weeping, looking at verse 33, and the Jews who had come with her, they were also weeping. He was deeply moved in his spirit, greatly troubled, and he said to them, where have you laid him? Come and see. So Jesus, at this point, he weeps. Why does he weep? He's sad. But he knows he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead in just a few moments. Why does he weep? Because he's human. Because he's sad because other people are sad. So he's not overcome with emotion where it's ruling him, because he knows that he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead. But so it's not just that he's overcome with emotion, but that he shares in the sufferings of those whom he loves. He's identifying with them. In spite of the fact that he knows otherwise, he shares with them this moment of grief because he knows their hurt. Not that they are hurt, but the hurt that they are experiencing, their hurt. And then they said, look how he loved him. There may have been talk, where's Jesus? And some talk saying, well, if he loved him, wouldn't he have been here? Wouldn't he have arrived? Wouldn't he have been here by now? But then they said, look, we were wrong if that did take place. Look how he loved him. And then others were a little more cynical. Well, one who had opened the eyes of the blind. So that's taking it back to where? John 9, the man born blind. If you could open the eyes of the man who was blind, could not he have kept this man from dying? So again, we even see that those that are there, they are speaking about a connection here, about an event that God had permitted so that he would be glorified, except they didn't know that and they didn't understand it yet. So Jesus, he comes to the place where Lazarus' body was laid in a tomb. There's a cave and a stone lay against it. Let's have a look at the screen. This is what is traditionally regarded as the tomb of Lazarus. And I need to bring this back up again. There we go. All right. So this is what is traditionally known as the tomb of Lazarus in Bethany. And then we have the inside of that tomb. It's a pretty big tomb. So being that large, what do you suppose is the reason that it's that large?
do they put one body?
It's like a family tomb, isn't it?
Family tomb. So more than one body in this. And this is a fairly sizable tomb. Jesus, he gets them to roll the stone away so that Lazarus can come out. Why doesn't Jesus go in to him?
He wants the people to see it.
He wants the people to see it, but could they not have seen what would be taking place when Lazarus comes out alive, whether Jesus is standing outside of the tomb or inside of the tomb?
Maybe he's trying to display his authority without having to touch him.
Okay, maybe that's part of it. Think of Jewish mindset. Pardon?
He said about those who hear the Son of Man's voice. Rise.
All right, so that's John 5. So these people here may not have been present for that or aware that that was the case.
They didn't have John 5.
So they weren't going back and reference, oh, that's what he said in John 5.
Would he be considered unclean if he went in there?
They would consider him unclean because he's going into a tomb. Would Jesus have been unclean?
No.
No, because he is untouchable by uncleanness. He overpowers, he overrules uncleanness. But had he gone into the tomb, what would have happened?
They would have thought he was unclean.
They would have thought he was unclean. That's not the only thing, though. Lazarus wouldn't have been the only one who had come out of the tomb. Because the Lord of life going into a place that contained the dead would have brought life to every corpse in that tomb.
Isn't that why he just said Lazarus' name?
And that's another aspect. Why did he speak just Lazarus come forth? Because the power in Jesus' word is life. It's authority. So anyone who's dead in that tomb, and if he just says, come forth, who's coming forth?
Everybody.
Everybody's coming out of that tomb. We laugh at it, but we need to realize there's a seriousness to this, that there is power in the word that Jesus speaks. And the power is resurrection power. So he didn't go in for two reasons. One, so that they couldn't accuse him or regard him as then being unclean. And secondly, had he gone into the place of the placement of the corpses of these dead, they all would have been revived. And as already observed, this is why, or we speculate why, he calls him by name, so that only one of these is brought back from the dead, the one who is called.
Great grandpa, grandma.
Yeah.
Twice removed.
And you might say, well, they were in ossuaries, the bone boxes. How could that happen? Listen, he's God. How is it going to happen when he calls them forth in the last day? By his power, the word of his mouth, the power of his word. Or as Hebrews chapter 1 speaks of, the word of his power. See, they're sad up until this point because this man is dead, and he was a righteous man. And the Jews had a saying that when a righteous man dies, the world suffers loss. Not just the family, but the world suffers loss when a righteous man dies. And here they're experiencing, and they're contemplating, it's not experiencing, they're contemplating Jesus' ability to heal. As they were speaking, well, if he was able to raise the dead, then what about this? See, this miracle is intended not only for Martha and not only for Mary and not only for the disciples, but it's also intended for everybody else that is there that day. And for Lazarus. It's a pretty impacting thing for Lazarus.
For us today.
And what Jesus is doing here is to say that the fourth day does not limit me. Dry bones in a box don't limit me. Isn't that what happens in Ezekiel's prophecy? The valley is filled with dry bones. Son of man, can these bones live? What's his response? You alone know. Oh Lord, you know. And then he says, prophesy to these bones. What is prophesying to the bones? What is prophecy? The Word of God. Speaking the Word of God. Not somebody presuming to speak the Word that so many people try to do. Thus saith the Lord, and then nothing happens. It's presumption. This was God speaking to Ezekiel, saying, speak to these bones. And so, as the old spiritual says, dry bones, them dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. And the foot bone's connected to the ankle bone and the anyway.
I saw it on a TV show the other day.
Now we see a little bunny hopping down a trail and see if we can follow it. I started something there. No, that was me. He is the life-giving Word. So, Martha protests when he says, take away the stone. Incidentally, why did he say, take away the stone? Why didn't he just stand in front of it and say, Lazarus, come forth, and by the power of his word, just have the stone by his word roll away? You would have done that. Power, drama, display. Why does he tell them to roll away the stone? Faith, so that's part of it. And with that, it's essentially saying, you do what you can do, faith, and I will do what only I can do. You trust me. But Martha has a concern. By this time, he
Stinketh.
very good, as if on cue. You rehearsed, right? All week long.
Yeah.
And then he says, didn't I tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? He doesn't say, if you believe, I will then raise him from the dead. He doesn't say that, does he? He says, if you will believe, you will see the glory of God. See, there will be many that will see a dead man come back to life, but they will not see the glory of God because they refuse to believe. There's a difference. So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifts up his eyes and he prays. What does he notice what he doesn't pray. He does not pray, Father, I ask you to give me favor and thereby raise Lazarus from the dead. He doesn't pray that, does he? Because he has power to raise the dead. What does he pray?
He thanks God that he has heard him.
And not only that he has, but in the essence, verse 42, that he always hears him. And, right, he speaks that not for himself, not to pep talk and to, pump himself up a little bit to get ready for this. This was in response to the people's needs, so that they would be aware that he is in full control and that he fully knows his relationship to the Father. And when he said these things, he cried out with a loud voice. Oh, he speaks it so that they would know that the Father had sent him. Do you remember that Jesus said, there's only one sign that I'm going to give you, and that's the sign of Jonah. What was the sign of Jonah? Belly of the fish, 3 days, 3 nights. And speaking primarily directly about Jesus' death and resurrection. But with his death and resurrection, this is the next sign that he gives that is similar to that, which is a signpost to his own resurrection. So he's saying, this is one of those signs that I said, this is the sign of Jonah I'm giving you. But it's not the ultimate fulfillment of that sign. And then he cries out with a loud voice and he says, by name, Lazarus. It's like saying, you alone. Lazarus, come out. And he did. The man who died came out. Notice what happens here. His hands and his feet were bound with linen strips, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said, unbind him and let him go. Do you notice that there's a difference between this coming back from the dead and when Jesus came back from the dead? When Jesus came back from the dead, when he came out of the grave, was he still bound with the grave clothes? He was unbound, and John speaks about it in John chapter 20. And when we come to John 20, and Peter looks into the tomb, what does he see? Not all of it. The head, there's one piece that's set to the side, the headpiece, and then the rest is just laying there as if he just came out of it like a shell, and then it just sort of collapsed upon itself. So part of it was folded, the head covering. Well, it wasn't folded. All right. When we look at that, there's a difference. Jesus, when he came back from the dead, he was resurrected, never to die again, and he left his grave clothes behind in the tomb. Lazarus, when he's brought back from the dead, he's resurrected, but not a resurrected life like Jesus, but the resurrected power that raised Christ from the dead also raised Lazarus' body, but Lazarus would die again.
He gets resurrected twice.
Yes, he does.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
And Lazarus comes out with his body is wrapped, hands and feet bound, linen strips around his face, wrapped with a cloth. So indicating that this is not the last time he will see death. But death has no hold on him because Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Well, we're going to end there. We'll look at the response fully next week, and then we're going to head off to another location in Judea, outside of the territory of central Judea.